Your paycheck doesn't disappear because you're careless. It disappears because it was already spoken for before it arrived. And the reason this feels confusing is because nothing dramatic happens when it vanishes. There's no mistake, no big purchase you regret, no moment where you say, that was dumb. It just fades. You get paid, you feel a brief sense of relief, and then quietly, almost automatically, that relief dissolves. Not into chaos, into normal. Bills get paid, subscriptions renew, balances move, and suddenly, the money that felt real a moment ago feels theoretical again. This is the part people misunderstand. They think disappearing money must be the result of bad decisions, impulse, overspending, or lack of discipline. But most paychecks don't disappear because of what you do with them. They disappear because of, of what they're already attached to. Before your money ever reaches your hands, it has a job list. And that list was built slowly over years without a single moment where you said yes to all of it at once. That's why it doesn't feel like a problem you can point to. It feels like gravity. Most people don't live paycheck to paycheck because they're irresponsible. They live paycheck to paycheck because their financial system runs on priority automation, not choice. And automation is invisible when it's working. Think about how your paycheck arrives. It doesn't show up as free money. It shows up as a temporary holding space. Almost immediately, it splits. Some of it goes to housing, some to transportation, some to insurance, some to utilities, some to obligations you don't even remember opting into. What's left over doesn't feel like extra. It feels like a remainder. And remainders don't feel powerful. They feel fragile. This is why even people making good money still feel uneasy, because the paycheck isn't an opportunity. It's a settlement, a reconciliation between promises already made. That's the illusion most people live inside. From the outside, everything looks fine. Yeah, bills are paid, no overdrafts, no collection calls. But internally, there's no sense of progress because progress requires unclaimed capacity, and most modern financial lives have none. Here's the subtle trap. When expenses are predictable, they stop feeling like decisions. They start feeling like facts. Rent isn't a choice, it's a reality. A car payment isn't a choice. It's just how things are. Subscriptions don't feel like spending, they feel like background noise. And once money becomes a background process, you stop interacting with it consciously. You don't decide where your paycheck goes. You watch where it goes. That distinction matters, more than people realize. Because when money moves without your attention, it trains your brain to disengage. You stop asking if something is still worth it, if it still serves you, if it still, aligns with what you want long term. Not because you don't care, but because caring doesn't change anything today. And today is the key word. Most money systems are built to optimize the present moment. They prioritize convenience, comfort, predictability, and low friction. They don't prioritize flexibility, resilience, or optionality. So your paycheck disappears into a structure that rewards stability over mobility. It keeps life smooth, but it also keeps life narrow. This is why raises don't fix the problem. When income increases, the system doesn't reset. It stretches. Expenses expand to absorb the difference, not because you're reckless, but because the system is designed to scale consumption faster than awareness. New income doesn't arrive as freedom. It arrives as permission. Permission to upgrade, permission to add, permission to commit a little more. Each new commitment feels reasonable on its own. That's why no single expense feels like the culprit. The problem isn't any one line item. It's the cumulative weight of everything that felt manageable at the time. By the time you notice the pressure, the structure is already built. And dismantling it feels disruptive, risky, and emotionally expensive. So most people don't, they adapt instead. They tell themselves, this is just how adulthood works. This is normal. This is what stability looks like. But stability and flexibility are not the same thing. Stability means things don't fall apart when nothing goes wrong. Flexibility means things don't fall apart when something does. Your paycheck disappearing instantly is a signal. not of failure, but of rigidity. It's telling you that your financial life has very little room to move. And room to move is what creates calm, not higher income, not better budgeting, room. In the next section, we're going to break down how this system quietly forms, why it feels unavoidable, and why most advice completely misses the real mechanism at work. Because once you can see the structure clearly, the disappearance stops feeling mysterious. It starts feeling mechanical. The reason your paycheck disappears instantly isn't because you built a bad system. It's because you never consciously built one at all. What you have is an accumulated system, formed piece by piece, decision by decision, each one made in isolation. And isolation is what hides the total cost. No one ever sits down and says, I want a financial life where my money feels tight forever. What people actually say is, this seems reasonable. I can afford this. It's not that much more, or I'll adjust later. And every one of those statements is true in the moment. That's how the system forms, not through recklessness, but through logic applied locally instead of globally. Think about how most commitments enter your life. They don't arrive all at once, they arrive sequentially. First comes housing, chosen to fit your income at the time, then transportation, then insurance, then utilities, then convenience upgrades, then lifestyle smoothing. Each decision is framed against your current situation, not your future total. And because each one fits on its own, your brain approves it. Your brain is very good at evaluating individual costs. It is very bad at sensing cumulative constraint. So the system grows quietly, not as a budget, but as a fixed structure. And by the time it's complete, it feels permanent. That's why advice like just cut expenses feels insulting. You're not looking at discretionary fluff. You're looking at pillars, rent, car, insurance, childcare, debt, health. These aren't cuts, they're architecture. And architecture doesn't change easily. This is where momentum matters. Most people assume money stress comes from volatility, from unpredictability, from not knowing what's coming. But for many people, the stress comes from the opposite. Everything is too predictable. You know exactly where your paycheck will go. You can map it before it arrives. That predictability removes decision making in the short term, but it also removes leverage in the long term, because leverage requires slack. Slack is what lets you respond instead of react. And modern financial systems are incredibly efficient at removing slack. They do this by turning optional choices into default behaviors: auto pay, auto renew, auto upgrade, auto escalation. Each one reduces friction, and friction reduction feels like progress until you realize friction was the only thing forcing awareness. When money moves automatically, attention disappears. You stop noticing when prices creep up. You stop revisiting old commitments. You stop questioning whether something still earns its place, not because you're lazy, but because there's no signal telling you to look. This is where the paycheck illusion deepens. On paper, your income looks sufficient. On paper, nothing is wrong. But your paycheck isn't funding your future. It's maintaining your past decisions. Every dollar is assigned backward, not forward. That's why it feels like you're always catching up instead of getting ahead. You're not steering, you're sustaining. And sustaining feels endless. Even when you try to budget, the structure doesn't change. You might track spending, categorize expenses, optimize around the edges. But budgeting works inside the system. It doesn't redesign it. So you end up doing mental labor without structural relief. You're aware, but still constrained. That's exhausting. This is why most people eventually stop trying. They don't give up on money, they give up on control. They accept the cycle. Paycheck arrives, bills clear, leftover shrinks. Repeat. And because nothing is technically wrong, they assume this is just adulthood. But adulthood isn't supposed to feel like financial suffocation. What's actually happening is that your system has no priority hierarchy. Everything gets paid because everything feels mandatory. There's no protected margin, no space where money accumulates before obligations touch it. Instead, obligations get first access, and whatever survives becomes your flexibility. That's backwards, but it's how almost everyone is set up. because commitments are framed as necessities and margin is framed as luxury. In reality, margin is infrastructure. Without it, even small disruptions feel catastrophic. A car repair, a medical bill, a job change, a rate increase, none of these are rare events, they're normal life. But without slack, normal life feels like crisis. So people respond the only way they can. They optimize behavior instead of structure. They look for hacks, side hustles, productivity tricks, or more income, which helps temporarily. But because the underlying system is unchanged, the pressure returns. This is why paycheck disappearance feels instant, not because the money has gone faster, but because your system processes it faster than your awareness. By the time you emotionally register the paycheck, it's already been absorbed. And there was never a moment where it felt usable. And money that never feels usable never feels empowering. In the next section, we're going to talk about the most misunderstood part of this entire dynamic. Why earning more often makes the problem worse, and how doing better financially can actually increase the speed at which your paycheck disappears. Not because of greed, but because of structure. This is the part that confuses people the most. They expect the problem to shrink as income grows. They expect relief to arrive automatically. But for a lot of people, the opposite happens. The paycheck doesn't last longer. It disappears faster, not because expenses explode overnight, but because the system tightens. When income is low, constraint is obvious. You feel every dollar. You notice every trade-off. But as income rises, visibility drops. You stop asking, can I afford this? And you start asking, does this fit? And fit is a much softer question. Fit doesn't mean optimal. It just means acceptable. So new money doesn't create freedom. It creates absorption capacity. The system simply gets better at consuming whatever you feed it. This is why raises often feel underwhelming. They don't arrive as open space. They arrive as an invitation to normalize a higher baseline, a slightly better apartment, a slightly nicer car, a few more conveniences, a little more insurance, a few more recurring comforts. None of these feel extravagant. Each one feels like progress, but progress without margin is just movement in place. The structure gets heavier, and heavier structures require more income just to stand still. That's the treadmill most people end up on. And here's something subtle but important. As income increases, expectations rise faster than awareness, not just your expectations, but everyone else's. Lenders approve you for more, service providers upsell you. Algorithms recommend higher tiers, social norms quietly shift. You don't feel pressured, you feel validated, like you're finally doing things right because nothing feels wrong. You don't question the new commitments. They feel earned. But earned doesn't mean harmless. Every new fixed cost reduces optionality. And optionality, is the only thing that slows paycheck disappearance. Without it, money becomes throughput. It comes in, it moves out, and it leaves no residue behind. Residue is what builds stability over time. Savings, buffers, choices. Without residue, every month resets to zero, even if the number is bigger. That's why two people with the same income can feel radically different. One has slack, the other has obligations. One experiences money as a tool, the other experiences it as maintenance. Same income, completely different structure. And structure determines experience more than income ever will. This is where common advice starts to fall apart. Just pay yourself first. Just save more. Just invest the difference. These ideas aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. Because if your system gives obligations first priority, paying yourself feels artificial. You're forcing money upstream against the current, and that takes constant effort. Effort works in the short term. It fails in the long term. Systems win. That's why willpower-based money advice burns people out. It asks you to fight the architecture of your life every single month. Eventually, you stop fighting. Not because you're weak, but because it's inefficient. Here's the acceleration mechanism most people never notice. As income grows, risk tolerance often shrinks. This surprises people. They think more money should mean more courage. But the more you have to lose, the more you protect what already exists. You become less willing to disrupt the system. You avoid changes that could destabilize your current lifestyle, even if those changes would improve your long term position. So instead of redesigning the structure, you reinforce it. Longer commitments, more insurance, more smoothing, more predictability. All of it feels responsible, and all of it locks your paycheck into tighter channels. This is why people who do everything right still feel stuck. They followed the rules, they increased income, they avoided obvious mistakes, but the rules never taught them how to preserve freedom inside the system, only how to optimize comfort. Comfort is expensive, not upfront, but over time, because comfort replaces margin with expectation, and expectations are relentless. They don't pause when income stalls. They don't reverse easily. They don't negotiate. They just wait for the next paycheck. That's why money stress doesn't feel like panic for most people. It feels like pressure, low grade, constant background pressure, the kind you stop noticing until it's gone. And that leads to the real realization. The goal isn't to make more money disappear slower. The goal is to change what gets first access to your paycheck. Until that changes, every improvement gets swallowed. Every raise gets normalized. Every win feels temporary. In the final section, we're going to talk about how to reverse this dynamic without blowing up your life. Not through extreme cuts, not through deprivation, but through a structural shift that gives your paycheck somewhere else to land before it disappears. If your paycheck disappears instantly, the solution is not to chase it harder, it's to give it somewhere else to land. Most people try to fix money problems by changing behavior. They track more, budget tighter, promise themselves they'll be more disciplined next month. That can work briefly, but then the system reasserts itself because behavior operates inside structure. If you want a different outcome, the structure has to change. And changing structure doesn't mean blowing up your life. It doesn't mean selling everything, moving to the woods, or cutting joy out of existence. It means reordering priorities so money stops arriving as a remainder. Right now, most paychecks follow the same order. Obligations first, lifestyle second. You last. Whatever survives becomes your margin. And that's why it always feels fragile. The shift is subtle, but it's powerful. Margin has to come first, not as an idea, but as a mechanism. This is where people get nervous because they hear restriction. But margin isn't restriction, it's insulation. It's the space that absorbs shock so you don't feel every bump. And the way you create it, is by intercepting the paycheck before the system drains it. This doesn't require dramatic numbers. It requires consistency and priority, a protected buffer that grows quietly, untouched by obligations. Not a savings account you raid when things get tight. Not an investment you mentally count as available. A buffer whose only job is to slow the system down. Because when the system slows, awareness comes back. And awareness changes decisions. When margin comes first, not every expense feels mandatory anymore. You start noticing which commitments are actually doing work for you and which ones are just inertia. You feel less urgency to upgrade, less pressure to smooth every inconvenience, and less fear around small disruptions. You're no longer operating at the edge. This is the part most people miss. Calm doesn't come from abundance. It comes from slack. And slack doesn't need to be massive to be effective. It just needs to exist before obligations. Once it does, everything else shifts. You stop needing every dollar to perform perfectly. You stop optimizing the short term at the expense of the long term. You stop feeling like progress is always just out of reach. This is also when income finally starts to help instead of hurt. When raises arrive in a system with margin, they don't get absorbed automatically. They create choice. You can decide whether to expand lifestyle or expand freedom, and that decision finally feels real because there's room to make it. This is why people who seem calm with money aren't necessarily richer. They're just, less compressed. Their financial lives have fewer rigid channels and more open space. And space is what turns money from pressure into a tool. So if your paycheck disappears instantly, don't ask where it went. Ask what got first access, because that question points directly to the fix. You don't need to eliminate everything. You don't need to overhaul overnight. You need to slowly reclaim priority, one protected layer at a time. When you do, the paycheck stops feeling like a temporary visitor. It becomes something that accumulates, something that builds, something that stays. And when money stays, even briefly, the entire emotional experience changes. Not because you're suddenly rich, but because you're no longer trapped in a system that consumes everything it touches. That's when the disappearance stops feeling inevitable. And that's when progress finally feels real.